JMeter Architecture. Here you can see working process. Apache JMeter is an Apache project that can be used as a load testing tool for analyzing and measuring the performance of a variety of services with the focus on web applications. Here you can see the working process. The user request for server connection is connected to the server via request sent to the appropriate server and simulate number of users. Server is connected to a server response. Server response is connected to JMeter saves all responses. JMeter saves all responses is connected to JMeter collects data to manipulate statistical information, and that is connected to the server, and the server is connected to the end process, and end process is connected to get report. Now we are here you can see components of JMeter. Penning down for your reference, here the test plan, thread group, samplers, listeners, workbench assertions, config element, logic controllers, and timer. All major components of JMeter, such as thread groups, samplers, listeners, and config elements, are you can see here. Please refer this diagram to understand each component and their relation to the specific modules of JMeter. Now we would start touching each component of JMeter along with the JMeter to know how it works and how can testers implement this in their testing. Please note that we won't be covering all samplers, listeners now. We will work on the most used ones. And test plan, just as a simple test plan in software testing consists of all steps which execute the script, JMeter test plan has the same purpose. Everything which is included in the test plan is executed in a sequence which is top to bottom or as per the defined sequence in the test plan. Test plan can be as simple as it could be with just thread group, sampler, and listener, and it starts getting more complex as soon as you start adding more elements like config elements, preprocessors, and controllers. As we all know that JMeter measure performance by generating virtual users and threads which hits the server under test if the real users are sending requests to the server. Therefore, every test plan should have the virtual users or thread group, as we call them in JMeter terms. Important points about test plan. The test plan should be saved before running. JMeter files or test plans are saved in the form of .jmx extension files. You can also save parts of the test plan as a different selection. For example, if you want to save HTTP request sampler with the listener, you can save it as test fragment, so it can be used in other test scenarios as well. Elements of workbench are not saved with the test plan. Thread group is a group of users which will be hitting the server under test either concurrently or in some predefined sequence. Thread group can be added to the test plan JMeter test plan by right-clicking the test plan. JMeter is all right-click stuff. You get all the options on the right-click. You can rename thread group name to your own. Just change the name and click anywhere outside the test plan window. You would see the name getting changed. It is very important to configure your thread group as per the test conditions. For example, if you want to test how web behaves when 100th user hits it concurrently, you can set thread group. Samplers. So how does JMeter knows what type of request has been sent to server? It is through samplers. Samplers are must to add to a test plan, as only it can let JMeter know what type of request need to go to which server and with any predefined parameters or not. Request could be HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, TCP, SMTP, SOAP, etc. Samplers can only be added to the thread group, not directly under test plan, as thread groups need to use a sampler to send a request to the server URL under test. Samplers can be added by path thread group, then sampler, then HTTP request. HTTP request, these are the most common requests sent to the servers. Say for example, we want 100 users to hit https://www.google.com concurrently. FTP request, path, then test plan, then thread group, then sampler, then FTP requests. FTP stand for file transfer protocol, and it is used to upload or download the file from the server. JMeter threads send requests to FTP servers to upload or download files from there and measure the performance. Listeners, so till now we have seen a few samplers sending requests to the server, but haven't analyzed the response yet. Performance testing is all about analyzing server responses in various form and then presenting the same to the client. Listeners are used to display the result of the test execution so that testers can get to know the stats. We have around 15 listeners in JMeter, but mostly used ones are table, tree, and graph. View result in a table. This is the most commonly used and easily understandable form of listeners. It displays the result in the form of a table which some important performance parameters. Listeners can be added directly under test plan or under the sampler. The difference is when you add the listener under sampler, it will show the results of that sample only. If we add the sampler directly under the test plan, it displays the result for all sampler up to the hierarchy. View result in a tree. This is another most commonly used listeners and provide details information with the request and response. One can also view the HTML page rendered in a in response apart from viewing JSON, XML, text, regex. It is very useful as testers can put assertions in response to received to be ensured that the test passed. JMeter results still show pass even if the response is not desired. For example, say we hit HTTP request on any website www.xyz.com, and the response we expect title xyz / title, or in simple words, when we hit this page company home page opens with its name. If we haven't put assertion, JMeter will still display the result since the hit has gone to the server. The workbench is not shown here. The workbench is a place where you can store these elements which are not in use in your current test plan, but which can be later copy pasted in it. When you save JMeter file, the components which are present in the workbench are not automatically saved. You must save them separately by right clicking and choose save as option. You all might be thinking, what is the use of workbench? Anyways, it is easy to add any component directly to JMeter's test plan. The reason of having workbench is that the user could do some experiments and try out new scenarios. As you already know, elements in workbench are not saved, so the user can literally use anything and then throw away. But there are some non-test components which are only available in the workbench. They are listed here: the HTTP mirror server, HTTPS test script recorder, property display. HTTPS test script recorder is the most important non-test element used in JMeter. It helps testers in recording the script and then configuring the load for each transaction. JMeter only record the request sent to the server. Don't get confused with record and play functionality of QTP Selenium. All requests are recorded and testers can apply the desired load on them to see the behavior. Elements are this element is very important for scenarios where testers don't know what all requests are going to from their application. They can use HTTP script recorder to record the application under testing. Performance testing of mobile application can also be done in this way by setting a JMeter proxy and then recording the request which our mobile app sent to the server. Step-by-step procedure you can go check online. The other component is assertions. It's not shown here. Till now we have covered how JMeter hits the server and how the responses are displayed via listeners. To ensure the response is received in a correct and as per expectation, we need to add assertions. Assertions are simply validations which we need to put on responses to compare the results. Here are some types of assertions. Here are the types of assertions commonly used: response assertion, duration assertion, size assertion, XML assertion, HTML assertion. Response assertion. In response assertion, we can add our own pattern string and then compare them with the response received from a server. For example, you all know response code 200 when any request returns some response successfully. So if we add pattern string response code equal to 102, then the test case should fail. Duration assertion. Duration assertion is very important and validates the server responded within a given amount of time. This can be used in scenarios where we need to sample 100 requests and ensure that every time response is received within the benchmark limit. For example, case 10 users are concurrently hitting google.com server and duration assertion is set to 1000 milliseconds. Config elements. Requests sent to the server can be further parameterized using some config elements which are executed before the actual request. A simple example of it could be reading values of a variable from CSV file for which CSV data set config is used. Here are some important config elements used in the performance testing in the web and mobile application. CSV dataset config, user defined variables, HTTPS request default, HTTPS cache manager, HTTPS cookie manager. CSV dataset config. CSV dataset config helps JMeter in picking values of some parameters from CSV file rather than passing different parameter in each separate request. For example, if we need to test logging functionality with a different set of users and passwords, then we can create two columns with CSV file and enter the values there so that JMeter can pick one for each request sent to the server. User-defined variables. It helps JMeter to pick values from a predefined variable. For example, support that you need to create a test plan in which you need to add many HTTP requests on the same URL, and there could be a scenario in which client plans to migrate it later to some different URL. So to avoid updating URL in each request, we can tell JMeter to pick up the URL from UDV, user-defined variable, which can be later updated to handle all requests to the updated URL. To avoid updating URL in each request, we can tell JMeter to pick the URL from the UDV, user-defined variable, which can be later updated to handle all request updated URL. HTTP request default. This config element is very useful for specifying the default values for HTTP request. To guide you more, take an example where we need to hit 50 different requests at Google server. In this scenario, we add the HTTP request default when we need not to specify server name, path, or any other properties like port number, connection timeout properties. Whenever it is specified, the HTTP request default config element is inherited by all HTTP requests. In this scenario, if we add the HTTP request default, then we need not to specify the server name, path, or any other properties like port name, port number, connecting timeout properties. Whatever is specified in HTTP request default config element is inherited by all HTTP requests. HTTP cache manager and HTTP cookie manager are used in making JMeter behave as a real-time browser. HTTP cache manager can clear cache after each request, whereas the other one can manage the cookies settings. Logic controllers and timers. Logic controllers and timers help JMeter control the flow of transactions. Timers ensure the delay in each thread if need to test any server. For example, if you need the HTTP request to wait for 5 seconds after HTTP request is completed, we can add the timer there. Logic controllers are used to define in the flow of requests which are sent to the server. It can also let you store requests for each module separately, such as logging and logout. Here you can see a test plan is connected to a thread group. The thread group is connected to logic controllers, config element, listeners, and samplers. Logic controller interacts with the if controller, module controller, loop controller, recording controller, random controller, transaction controller. Config element interacts with the CSV dataset config, HTTP request default, user default variable, and HTTP cache manager. Listeners interacts with graph, table, tree, and summary report. Samplers interacts with HTTP request, FTP request, LDAP, LDAP request, SOIP request, and TCP request. Here you can see parent-child relationship in elements relationship. Here you can see all the 12 elements on a screen which are connected through some lines and arrows. The tail of the arrow is at the parent end, and the head of the arrow is at the child end. So if you start with the tail, follow the line and stop at the head, that will be the child of the tailed end the parents. So here test plan is connected to non-test elements and test fragment and thread users, and here the sessions. Here the threads users are connected to a test fragment and config element, and preprocessor and post-processor, listener, timer, and assertions. Here the test fragment is connected to sampler, and here the thread users are connected to test logic controller and sampler, and logic controller are connected to sampler, and here the sampler and logic controllers are connected to config element, preprocessor, post-processor, listener, timer, and assertions. Here the non-test elements are connected to preprocessor, listener, and timer. So we can also consider the child element of test plan as non-test element, test fragments, and threads users. And here the child elements of threads thread users are test fragments and logic controllers and assertions, and timer and listener and post processor and preprocessor and config elements. And child elements of test fragments are config element, preprocessor, post processor, listener, timer, and assertions, and sampler. And child elements of logic controllers are here the sampler and config element, preprocessor, post processor, listener, timer, and assertions. And child elements of samplers are samplers and logic controllers. Samplers are config element, preprocessor, post processor, listener, timer, and assertion. The non-test child elements of non-test elements are preprocessor, listener, and timer. This is another way of looking at parent-child relationship. Now here you can see the elements in JMeter test plan. JMeter has very complex architecture that provides support for several inbuilt elements and allow extending functionality of JMeter through plugins. It has many elements like processors, listeners, etc. In simple terms, different types of JMeter elements represent the different features provided by JMeter. It has many elements like JMeter has very complex architecture that provides support for several inbuilt elements and allows extending the functionality of JMeter through plugins. It has many elements like samplers, processors, listeners, etc. In simple terms, different types of elements represent the different features provided by JMeter. Here we will provide brief overview of the most commonly used elements in JMeter and their features. test plan. A test plan is the top level body of JMeter, explains sequence of steps executed at runtime. A final test plan made up of one or more thread groups, sampler, logic controller, listener, timers, assertions, and configuration elements. Each sampler can be preceded by one or more pre-processor element, followed by post-processor element and or assertion element. It saves in Java management extensions JMX format. Test plan is the biggest element in JMeter. It is often the root element in most steps performed and is at the top of the hierarchy of JMeter element architecture. Thread group is the most basic element of any test plan. It controls all the threads that JMeter uses to execute the test cases. Thread group elements are beginning points of any test plan. All controllers and samplers must be under a thread group. Other elements, for example, listeners, may be placed directly under the test plan, in which case they will apply to all thread groups. As the name implies, the thread group element controls the number of threads JMeter will use to execute your test. If you mention 10 numbers of the threads in the JMeter, will generate and simulate 100 users requests to the server under test. JMeter allows thread group to be configured as follows. Simulate the number of real users connected to a web server by defining number of threads in a thread group. Set duration within which all threads have to be run, called ramp up period. Number of times to execute each thread. Each thread can repeat a certain number of times. Set the schedule to start the thread. There is a checkbox named scheduler to ensure this option. Samplers. In order for you to display anything on your system, web browser must make a request to a server and then receive appropriate response, then process it. These requests are various types, and when we use JMeter to mimic the user using his or her browser to make such requests, we need some elements which distinguishes between the type of request made. This is done by samplers, which is another one of elements the JMeter test plan. Samplers tell JMeter to send requests to a server and wait for a response. They are processed in order they appeared in the tree. Samplers facilitate JMeter to deliver explicit types of requests to the server. It simulates the user request for a page from the target server, so that to avail post, get, delete functions on the HTTP service can user add a HTTP request sampler. There are different types of samplers in JMeter test plan, which are provided by JMeter. Some of them are not, that these are not all the samplers. FTP requests, HTTP request, JDBC request, Java object request, LDAP request, SOAP or XML RPC request, and SMTP. Logic controllers. Logic controllers are the second type of controllers besides samplers. Samplers help us creating the type of request, for example HTTP request, wherein logic controllers define how to control these requests based on the logic, such as setting the schedule to send the request. These determine which request to be sent, etc. Logic controllers decide the order of processing of samplers in a thread. Logic controllers can change the order of requests coming from their child elements. They can modify the requests themselves, cause JMeter to repeat requests, etc. JMeter provides following logic controllers: runtime controller, if controller, transaction controller, recording controller, while controller, switch controller, for each controller, module controller, include controller, loop controller, once only controller, interleave controller, random order controller, and throughput controller. JMeter manual page has a very good description of how the logic controllers would make the change in the working of a JMeter test plan. Listeners, after creating a second and creating and sending a request to the server, JMeter received a result returned from the server. Listeners help users to access the server response and analyze the test results. Test data can be presented in several formats such as graph, table, tree view, logs files, etc. JMeter provides several listeners in order to capture and read the data in graphical, textual, or tabular formats, among other. Listeners offer a means to collect, save, and view the results of a test plan and store results in XML format or more efficient but less detailed CSV format. The output can be viewed directly within the JMeter console. It basically adjusts anywhere in the test. Moreover, under the test plan, gather data only from elements at or below their level. Listeners of JMeter provide these many things: graph results, spelling visualizer, assertion results, simple data writer, monitor result, distributed graph, alpha, aggregate graph, mailer visualizer, bean shell listener, summary report, sample results, save configuration, graph full results, view results tree, aggregate result, and view results in a table. Important points to note about listeners: the data collected by all the listeners is the same. The only difference between the listener is in the way the information is displayed. Listeners can be added to at any level. Listeners will capture the data for the level at which it was added and the level below it. You can add different listener for each thread group. In which case it will only capture data for that thread group. Listeners added to the test plan will capture the data for the complete test plan and all thread groups in it. You can configure the data to be captured by clicking on the config button on the listener. You can configure the listener to capture the data in a file as a CSV or JTL by providing the file name and the path for the file where the data is logged. This feature is available in every listener. Timers. In the real world, when user visits a website on a browser, he or she must wait a certain amount of time until the website completely loaded in the web browser before they can perform next action. To simulate this scenario, JMeter creates many HTTP requests to the server. By default, those requests are sent to the server continuously without any delay between them. It may cause the server under test to overload, and this may not portray the result seen in the real life. Therefore, you need to create a time delay between each request. JMeter offers elements called the timer elements that you can use in such scenarios. Purpose of the time element to post a JMeter thread presenting a virtual user for a certain amount of time. JMeter provide following types of timers: synchronizing timer, JSR223 time, bean shell time, Gaussian random timer, uniform random timer, constant throughput timer, BSF time, and Poisson random time. Assertions. Now you HTTP request sent to samplers. You can change the logic using logic controllers, and you can post the thread using the timers. But how would you actually know the result that you return from the server is actually correct and is what you needed? This is when assertions come into play. Assertions allow you to assert facts about responses received from the server being tested. Using an assertion, you can essentially test that your application is returning the result you expect it to. Assertions are statements that verifies test result, either positive or negative. Assertions in JMeter can be applied to many elements such as test plan, thread group, or samplers. Configuration elements. Configuration elements are somewhat similar to what settings menu or options would do in a tool. You can use this element to modify or change requests that are going out to a JMeter test plan. Configuration elements can be used to add or modify the param values of the request generated via samplers. Example, let us assume that you need to create a test plan with 20 HTTP requests, HTTP request samplers to the same application, but different paths to test different scenarios. By using HTTP request default config element, you can only need to enter the common default once the config element, and you can skip them in the sampler. You will not need to enter the same detail 20 times again in the sampler. All samplers will inherit the HTTP request default properties. As per the JMeter manual page, a configuration element is accessible from only inside the tree branch where you place the element. For example, if you place HTTP cookie manager inside the simple logic controller, the cookie manager will only accessible to HTTP request controller to the HTTP request controllers you place inside the simple logic controller. The cookie manager is accessible to the HTTP requests web page 1, web page 2, but not web page 3, for example. If the configuration element is inside the branch manager, inside the tree branch also a configuration element inside the tree branch has a higher precedence than the same element in the parent branch. For example, we define two HTTP request default element, web default 1, web default 2. Since we place web default 1 inside the loop controller, the only web page 2 can access it. The other HTTP request will use the web default since we place it in the thread group, the parents of the other branches. Preprocessor elements. A preprocessor element is an interesting thing that which execute before sampler execute. It's basically used to modify the settings of the sample request before it runs or update variables that are not extracted upon extracted from response text. These are lists made up of all preprocessor element JMeter, JDBC preprocessor, JSR223 preprocessor, regex user parameters, bean shell preprocessor, BSF preprocessor, HTML link parser, HTTP URL rewriting modifier, HTTP user parameter modifier, and user parameters. Postprocessor elements. A postprocessor gets executed after finishing a sampler execution process. This element is basically useful to procedure the response data, for example, to retrieve particular value for later use. These are the list made up of all postprocessor element in JMeter: CSS jQuery extractor, bean shell postprocessor, GSR223 post processor, JDBC post processor, debug post processor, regular expressions extractor, XPath extractor, result status action handler, BSF post processor. Here you can see here the JMeter, and you can see the thread group here. Below that, sampler, logic controller, listener, configuration element, sessions, timers, and processor. Below samplers, here you can see, for example, request, publisher, logic controllers, for example, record control, mobile control, listeners, for example, report, graph, configuration elements, for example, HTTP, FTP, TCP, assertions, response assertions, size assertions, for example, timers, constant, uniform, for example, processors, preprocessor, and post processor. Here you can see one controller node with multiple worker nodes in Apache JMeter distributed testing. Here we explained how to use the multiple systems to perform stress testing. Before we start, there are a couple of things to check. The firewalls on the systems are turned off or correct ports are opened. All the clients are on the same subnet. The server is in the same subnet. 192.x.x.x or 10.x.x.x IP addresses are used. If the server doesn't use 192.xs or 10.xs IP addresses, there shouldn't be any problems. Make sure JMeter can access the server. Make sure you use the same version of JMeter and Java on all the systems. Mixing versions will not work correctly. You have set up SSL for RMI or disabled it. Once you have made sure the systems are ready, it's time to set up remote testing. Here we assume you already have the JMeter installed on all systems. The way JMeter works is one controller node initiates the test on multiple worker nodes. Here the 192.168.0.2 is connected to 192.168.0.10 and 192.168.0.11 and 192.168.0.12 and 192.168.0.15 and 192.168.0.14 and 192.168.0.13. Here we are considering categories in systems and regarding terminology in Apache JMeter distributed testing. Here we can define the terms and make sure the definitions is clear. The controller node, the system running JMeter GUI, which controls the test. Worker node, the system running JMeter -server, which takes commands from GUI and send requests to the target systems. Target, a web server we plan to stress test. Here the control node is connected to worker nodes, and worker nodes are connected to target. Here you can see how JMeter load testing simulate the heavy load. JMeter performance testing is testing method performed using Apache JMeter to test performance of a web application. For example, JMeter for performance testing helps to test both static and dynamic resources, helps to discover concurrent users on website and provide variety of graphical analysis for performance testing. JMeter performance testing include load test and stress test of web, for example here web application. Apache JMeter testing tool offers following benefits in performance testing. JMeter can be used to test performance testing in both static resources such as JavaScript and HTML. As well as dynamic resources such as JSP, servlets, and Ajax. JMeter can discover maximum number of concurrent users that your website can handle. JMeter provides a variety of graphical analysis of performance reports. JMeter performance testing include load testing, modeling the expected usage by simulating multiple usage access and the web service concurrently. Stress testing. Every web server has a maximum load capacity. When the load goes beyond the limit, the web server starts responding slowly and produce errors. The purpose of stress testing is to find the maximum load of the web server can handle. Here you can see the stress handling the heavy load. Here you can see how JMeter load testing simulate heavy load. This is about load testing. Here you can see Apache JMeter make copy of samples and running them in a separate thread. Is connected to user 1 to sampler 1. Sampler 2 and sampler n via create and users. You can see send request and HTTP response inside the sampler, and here you can see application under test. Here you can see the order of execution in the order of component execution. The programming languages evaluate the expression by following certain rules based on operator precedence. For example, in an expression a plus b multiplied c, the operation b multiplied by c is performed first, and then the result is added to the a. Although the operator asterisk is not asterisk for multiplication is not the first operator appearing in the expression, it is applied first as it has a higher precedence value. Similarly, JMeter follows certain rules while executing the component in a test plan. Within a thread group, the order of execution of the components follows the order shown in this figure. Even if a listener component are placed at the first element in the thread in the thread group, it will be executed after samplers and post processors. However, controllers and samplers have the same precedence, so they will be executed in the order in which they appear in the test plan. Here the config elements, preprocessors, timers, logic controllers or samplers, post processors, accessions and listeners are inside thread group. Config elements are connected to preprocessor element, preprocessors. Preprocessors are connected to timers. Timers are connected to logic controllers or samplers. Logic controllers or samplers are connected to post processors. Post processors are connected to assertions. Assertions are connected to listeners. JMeter allows the elements to be nested. For example, a listener a timer, and a sampler can be nested under a logical controller. In this case, when the logical controller is being executed, the order of execution of its child nodes would be the timer, sampler, then listener. Here you can see the test plan in order of component execution. Here, this shows the order of execution in the test plan. As you can see, the JMeter test plan, the components are not in sequence. However, the JMeter will rearrange them according to the order of execution. Note that the CSV dataset config is nested under transaction controller. The child elements nested under transaction controller would again follow the order of execution and get sequenced. For the given test plan, the execution order will be 1 bean shell preprocessor, 2 constant timer, 3 constant throughput timer, 4 transaction controller, 5 CSV data config, 6 HTTP request, 7 bean shell post processor, 8 aggregate report. Note. Here you can see a directory, JMeter directory structure. It's reasonably easy to install JMeter. You just need to extract zip file downloaded in the downloaded. After unpacking the zip file, you would see a tree layout, something like the one shown here. Here's a brief checklist of folders that you will see after extracting the JMeter zip file. Bin holds the script file to launch JMeter. Docs, offline reference docs. Extras and script extensions. Lib holds helper jar lib for JMeter. Then ext contains JMeter protocol libs. Then JUnit lib for JMeter. Printable docs contain read to print docs. JMeter is organized by protocols and functionalities. This is done so that the developer can build new jars for a single protocol without having to build the entire application. We will go into the details of building. Since most of the JMeter developers use Eclipse. Here we are describing using Eclipse directory structure as a reference point. The top level directory is bin, contains the .bat and .sh files for starting JMeter. It also contains Apache JMeter.jar and properties file. Build directory is not visible here. The created by build script and that is where the various artifacts created during the build process are kept, and dist directory created by build script, that is where distributions are generated. It's not shown here. Docs directory contains the JMeter documentation files. Extras and related extra files. Lib contains the required jar files for JMeter. SRC contains a subdirectory for each protocol and components, not shown here. Test unit test related directory, not shown here. Xdocs XML files for documentation. JMeter generates documentation from XML, is not shown here. Lib directory structure. ext contains the core jar files for JMeter and the protocols. The reason for the separation in JMeter searches these jar files just for JMeter specific classes. Startup would much slower if the JMeter search all the jars in the lib directory. OPT directory, not shown here, contains optional jar files that JMeter can use for additional functionality. These jars are included when building and running JMeter, but they are not stored in CVS. Usually due to licensing issues, users can download optional jars separately and put here. They may have to create the directory. SRC directory structure is not shown here. The core directory, the core code of the JMeter, including all core interfaces and abstract classes. Components contain non-protocol specific component like visualizers, associations, etc. Example sampler demonstrating how to use the new Bean framework. Yeah, and components contain non-protocol specific components like visualizers and associations. Example sampler demonstrating how to use the new Bean framework. Functions, the directory, standard functions used by all component. HTML parser directory, snapshot of HTML parser donated by HTML parser object on SourceForge. Jopen directory, utility classes providing common utility functions. Monitor directory, Tomcat 5 monitor components. Report directory, report generating tool for processing test results. Protocol directory contains the reference protocol JMeter supports. This directory is inside SRC directory, is not shown here. Protocol directory structure, it's under protocol, and it's in the protocol directory is under inside the SRC. There you can see a HTTP directory component for load testing servers that use HTTP web servers, SOAP servers, XML, RPC services, etc. FTP component for load testing FTP servers. Java directory component for load testing Java components. JDBC directory component for load testing JDBC servers using JDBC. JNDI directory component for load testing JNDI, currently non-functional. LDAP directory component for load testing LDAP servers. Mail directory component for load testing mail servers. TCP directory component for load testing TCP services. JMS directory component for load testing JMS messaging services. As a general rule, samplers related to HTTP will reside in HTTP directory. The exception to rule is the Tomcat 5 monitor. It's separate because functionality of the monitor is slightly different than stress or functional testing. It may eventually be reorganized, but for now it is in its own directory. In terms of difficulty, writing visualizers is probably one of the higher plugins to write, and this protocol directory is mentioned just before inside SRC in protocol directory, and there is in SRC directory. These directories are not shown in this figure. So here you can see a JMeter based folder in this picture. You can see bin directory, docs, extras, libs, licenses, printable docs, and here the files license notice readme. So here you can see a root directory Apache JMeter 3.0. Inside it you can see bin directory, docs, libs, licenses, printable docs. Inside bin you can see example report template and templates. This is JMeter script folder. And here inside docs you can see API, CSS and images. Here inside lib you can see ext and JUnit. This is JMeter helper libraries. Inside licenses you can see bin and src. Here you can see inside printable docs you can see demos, extending, localizing and user manual. Now we are focusing on user requests for server connection. User requests for server connection. Here you can see thread group. A thread group defines a pool of users that will execute a particular test case against your server. In the thread group GUI, you can control the number of users simulated, a number of threads, the ramp up time, how long it takes to start all the threads, the number of times to perform the test, and optionally a start and stop time for the test. Here you can see the thread group here. The thread group is connected to server. One user simulates one user request is passed from thread group to server. 20 user simulates 20 user requests is passed from thread group to server. 50 user simulates 50 user requests is passed from thread group to server. 100 user simulates 100 user requests is passed from thread group to server. As an example, we can consider this. This is a screenshot of control panel of HTTP request. The sampler HTTP request. The sampler lets you send an HTTP or HTTPS request to a web server. It also lets you to control whether or not JMeter passes HTML files or for images and other embedded resources and sends HTTP request to retrieve them. Following type of embedded resources are retrieved: images, applets, style sheets, CSS, and resources reference from those files, external scripts, frames, iframes, background images, body, table, TD, and TR, background sound. Here you can see name parameter. This is a descriptive name for this sampler that is shown in the tree. Server, the domain name or IP address of the web server, for example www.example.com. Do not include the HTTP :// prefix. Note, if the host header is defined in the header manager, then this will be used as the virtual host name. Server name is required unless it is provided by HTTP request defaults or a full URL including name, host, and port. Scheme : / host : port is set in path field. Port the web server is listening to default 80. Connection timeout, number of milliseconds to wait for a connection to open. Response timeout, number of milliseconds to wait for a response. Note that this applies to each wait for a response. If the server response is set in several chunks, the overall elapsed time may be longer than the timeout. A duration assertion can be used to detect responses that take too long to complete. Under HTTP request, the implementation Java or HTTP for client 4, if not specified and not defined by HTTP request defaults, the default depends on the value of the JMeter property JMeter.http sampler. Failing that, the HTTP4 implementation is used. Protocol HTTP, HTTPS or file, default is HTTP. Method get, post, head, trace, options, put, delete, patch, not supported for Java implementation. With HTTP4, the following methods related to web dev are also allowed: copy, lock, mkcol, move, prop find, prop patch, unlock, report, mk calendar, search. More methods can be predefined for the HTTP4 by using JMeter property HTTP sampler.user_define_methods. Content encoding to be used for post, put, patch and file. This is the character encoding to be used and is not related to the content encoding HTTP header. Path, the path to resource, for example /servlets/my-servlet. If the resource required query string parameters, add them below in the send parameters with the request section. As a special case, if the path start with http:// or https:// then this is used as the full URL. And in this case, the server port and protocol fields are ignored. Parameters are also ignored for get and delete. Methods. Also, please note that the path is not encoded apart from replaces spaces with %20. So unsafe characters may need to be encoded to avoid errors such as URI syntax exception. Here you can see the server proxy, hostname or IP address of a proxy server to perform request. Do not include http:// prefix. Port the proxy server is listening. Username, optional username for proxy server. Password, optional password for proxy server. Not this. This is stored encrypted in the test plan. Uh, Redirect automatically sets the underlying HTTP protocol handler to automatically follow redirects, so they are not seen by JMeter and thus will not appear as samples. Should only be used for get and get and head requests. The HTTP sampler will reject attempts to use for it for post and put. Warning, you can also see information on cookie and header handling. Follow redirects. This only has any effect if redirect automatically is not enabled. If set, the JMeter sampler will check if the response is a redirect and follow it if we saw. The initial redirect and further responses will appear as additional samples. The URL and data fields of the parent sample will be taken from the final non-redirected sample, but the parent bytes count and elapsed time include all samples. The latency is taken from initial response. Note that HTTP client sampler may log the following message: redirect requested, but follow redirects is disabled. This can be ignored. JMeter will collapse paths of the form /, then / path segment / segment in both absolute and relative redirect URLs. For example, HTTP : / hostname /1 / path segment /2 will be collapsed into HTTP : // host /2. If necessary, this behavior can be suppressed by setting the JMeter property HTTP sampler .redirect removes last ... equal false. Keep alive. JMeter sets the connection keep alive header. This does not work properly with the default HTTP implementation, as connection reuse is not under user control. It does work with Apache HTTP components, HTTP client implementations. Use multipath for mdata for HTTP post. Use multipath for /form data or application / www form URL encoded post requests. Browser compatible headers. When using multipath for /form data, this suppresses the content type and content transfer encoding headers. Only the content disposition header is sent. Send parameters with request. The query string will be generated from the list of parameters you provide. Each parameter has name and value. The options to encode the parameter and an option to include or exclude the equal sign. Some applications don't expect an equal sign where the value is the empty string. The query string will be generated in the correct fashion depending on the choice of method you made. If you choose get or delete, the query string will append to the URL. If post and put, if post or put, then it will be sent separately. Also, if you are sending a file using multipath form, The query string will be created using the multipart form specification. Additionally, you can specify whether each parameter should be URL encoded. If you are not sure what this means, it is probably the best to select it. If your values contain characters such as following, then encoding is usually required. ASCII control characters, non-ASCII characters, reserved characters. URLs use some characters for special use in defining their syntax. When these characters are not used in their special role inside URL, they need to be encoded. Example, $, ampersand, plus, comma, /, colon, semicolon, equal, question sign, ampersand, sign. Unsafe characters. Some characters present the possibility of being misunderstood within URLs for various reasons. These characters should also always be encoded. Example, space, less than, greater than, hash, percentage, etc. Here in the you can see the HTTP request control panel. You can see name and comments. Here you can there are you can see basic and advanced. Under web server you can provide details for server name or IP and port number. Under timeout you can specify connect and response in milliseconds. Under HTTP request you can specify implementation protocol, which is default to HTTP, and method and content encoding. And also you can specify path, and you can see the options for redirect automatically, follow redirects, use keep alive, use multipart, form data for post, and browser compatible headers. And you can see parameters, body data, and files upload. Under send parameter with the request you can see name, value, and encode and include equals. And here you can also see details, add from clipboard, delete, up and down. Under proxy server you can specify server name, IP, port number, username, and password. Here you can see a screenshot of control panel of thread group. A thread group defines a pool of users that will execute a particular test case against your server. In the thread group GUI, you can control the number of users simulated, number of threads, the ramp up time, how long it takes to start all the threads, the number of times to perform the test, and optionally start and stop time for the test. Here you can see these parameters, and this is name attribute, descriptive name for this element that is shown in the tree. An action to be taken after a sampler error determines what happens if a sampler error occurs, either because the sample itself failed or an assertion failed. The possible choices are continue, ignores the error and continue with the test, start next thread loop, ignore the error, start next loop and continue with the test, stop thread, current thread exits, stop test. The entire test is stopped at the end of any current samples. Stop test now. The entire test is stopped abruptly. Any current samples are interrupted if possible. Number of threads, number of users to simulate, this is required. This parameter is required. Ramp up period, how long JMeter should take to get all the threads started. If there are 10 threads and ramp up time of 100 seconds, then each thread will begin 10 seconds after previous thread started, for a total time of 100 seconds to get the test fully up to speed. First thread will always start directly, so if you configured one thread, ramp up time is effectively 0. For the same reason, 10th thread in this example will actually be started after 90 seconds and will and not 100 seconds. The example is actually not shown here. We have to consider the situation we discussed before, that if there are 10 threads and ramp up time is of 100 seconds, then each thread will begin 10 seconds after the previous thread started. That was the example we are talking about. And here you can see loop count, number of times to perform the test case, alternatively infinite, can be selected, causing the test to run until manually stopped or end of the thread lifetime is reached. This number of thread is a required parameter, and ramp up time, ramp up period is also a required parameter. This loop count also is also required unless infinite is selected. Here delay thread creation until needed. If selected, threads are created only when the appropriate proportion of the ramp up time has elapsed. This is most appropriate for tests with a ramp up time that is significantly longer than the time to execute a single thread. That is where earlier threads finish before later ones start. If not selected, all threads are created when the test starts. They then pause for the appropriate proportion of the ramp up time. This is the original default and is appropriate for tests where threads are active throughout most of the test. Specify thread lifetime. If selected, confines thread operation time to the given bounds. These two parameters are also required parameters. duration in seconds. If the scheduler checkbox is selected, one can choose retrieve end time. JMeter will use this to calculate the end time. Startup delay. If the scheduler checkbox is selected, one can choose a relative startup delay. JMeter will use this to calculate the start time. Here you can see the screenshot of the control panel of thread group. Here you can see your name and comments. Under action to be taken after a sampler error, you can select continue, startup, next thread loop, stop thread, stop thread, and stop test, or stop test now. Under thread properties, you can specify number of threads, users, ramp up time period in seconds, loop count, and you can also tick select infinite here, and you can also select a sample user on each iteration, delay thread creation until needed, and specify thread lifetime. And you can also see duration in seconds and startup delay in seconds here. Now we are considering adding default HTTP request properties in building a web test plan. Here you can see the HTTP defaults for our test plan. Now that we have in the moment defined the users, it is time to define the task that they will be performing. Here you will specify the default settings for your HTTP request, and then the you will add HTTP request elements which use some of the default settings you specify there. Begin by selecting the JMeter users thread group element. Click on your right mouse button and you get to get the add menu, then select add, then config element, then HTTP request defaults, then select this new element to view its control panel. Like most element, HTTP request default control panel has a name field that you can modify. In this example, leave this field with the default value. Skip the next field, which is a web service server name or IP. For test plan that you are building, all HTTP requests will be sent to the same web server, jmeter.apache.org. Enter this domain name into the field. This is only field that we will specify a default to leave the remaining fields with their default values. The HTTP request default element does not tell JMeter to send an HTTP request. It simply defines the default values that the HTTP request element use. This figure for the completed HTTP request default element. Now we are considering adding HTTP requests. Here you can see the HTTP request for JMeter homepage. In our test plan, we need to make 2 HTTP requests. The first one is for the JMeter homepage, http://jmeter.apache.org, and the second one is for the changes page, http://jmeter.apache.org/changes.html. JMeter send the request in order that they appear in the tree. Start by adding the first HTTP request to the JMeter users element. Add, then sampler, then HTTP requests. Then select HTTP request element in the tree and edit the following properties. Change the name field to homepage. 2, set the path field to /. Remember that you do not have to set the server name field because you already specified this value in the HTTP request default element. Here you can see HTTP request for JMeter homepage. Next, add the second HTTP request and edit the following properties. See the figure here. First, change the name field to changes and set the path to /changes.html. Here you can see HTTP request for the JMeter changes page. Now we are considering adding JDBC requests in building a database test plan. Here you can see the JDBC request for the first SQL request. After defining the users, it's time to define the task that they will be performing. In this here you will specify JDBC requests to perform. Begin by selecting JDBC users element. Click your right mouse button to get the add menu and then select add, then config element, then JDBC configuration, then select this new element to view its control panel. You can see the figure here. That is the JDBC configuration. Set up the following field. This assume we will be using MySQL database called cloud. The variable name here my database bound to pool. This need to uniquely identify the configuration. It is used by JDBC sampler to identify the configuration to be used. JDBC URL database URL, that's the JDBC :mysql : IP of the server for colon 3306 / cloud. JDBC driver name, that's com.mysql.jdbc.driver. Username, the username of the database, and password for the database, password for the username. The other fields on the screen can be left as default. JMeter creates the database connection pool with the configuration settings. As specified in the control panel. The pool is referred in the JDBC request in the variable name. Variable name field. Several different JDBC configuration elements can be used, but they must have unique names. Every JDBC request must refer to a JDBC configuration pool. More than one JDBC request can refer to the same pool. Selecting the JDBC users element again. Click your right mouse button to get add menu, and then select add, then sampler, then JDBC request, then select this new element to view its control panel. In our test plan, we make two JDBC requests. First one is for the select all running VM instances. And the second is to select expunging. And expunging VM instance, obviously you should change these two examples appropriate for your particular database. This illustrated here. JMeter sends request in the order that you add them to the tree. Start by editing the following properties here. Change the name to VM running. Enter the pool name. My database. Same as in the configuration element. Enter the SQL query string field. Enter the parameter values field with the running value, and enter the parameter types with the varchar. This figure, you can see here JDBC request for the first SQL request. Next, add the second JDBC request and edit the following properties here. Change the name to VM expunging, and change the variable value of parameter values to expunging. Here you can see the JDBC request for the second request. Now we are considering adding default FTP request properties in building an FTP test plan. Here you can see the defaults for our test plans. Now we have, after defining the users, it's time to define the task that they will be performing. In here you will specify the default settings for your FTP request, and then you will add FTP request element which use some of the default settings you specified here. Begin by selecting the FTP users element. Click your right mouse button to get the add menu, and then select add, then config element, then FTP request default. Then select this new element to view its control panel. Like most JMeter element, FTP request default control panel has the name field that you can modify. In this example, leave this field with the default value. Skip the next field, which is skip to the next field, which is FTP server name or IP. For the test plan that you are building, all FTP requests will be sent to the same FTP server, ftp.domain.com. In this case, enter this domain name into the field. This is the only field that we will specify a default. so leave the remaining fields with their default values. FTP request default element does not tell JMeter to send FTP request. It simply defines the default values that the FTP request elements use. Here you can see the completed FTP request default element. Now we are considering adding FTP requests. In our test plan, we need to make 2 FTP requests. JMeter send requests in the order that they appeared in the tree. Start by adding the first FTP request to the FTP users element. Add, then sampler, then FTP request. Then select the FTP request element in the tree and edit the following properties. Change the name to file1. Change the remote file field to /directory /file1.txt. Step 3, then change the username field to anonymous, and change the password field to for example anonymous@test.com. You do not have to set the server name field because you already specified this value in the FTP request default element. Here you can see the FTP request for file1. Next, add the second FTP request and edit the following properties. See the figure here. Change the name to file2, to change the remote file field name, remote file field to /directory /file2.txt. 3, change the username field to anonymous. 4, change the password field to anonymous@test.com. Here you can see the FTP request for file2. Now we are considering adding LDAP request defaults in building an LDAP test plan. Begin by selecting LDAP users element. Here you can see LDAP default for our test plan. Begin by selecting LDAP users element. Click your right mouse button to get add menu, then select add, then config element, then LDAP request defaults. Then select this new element to view its control panel. Like most JMeter elements, LDAP request defaults control panel has a name field that you can modify. In this example, leave this field with the default value. Here you can see LDAP default for our test plan. Enter DN field to your LDAP root distinguish name. Enter LDAP server name field to ldap.test.com, port to 389. These values are default for the LDAP requests. Now we are considering adding LDAP requests. Here you can see LDAP request for inbuilt add test. In our test plan, we need to make your 4 LDAP request: inbuilt add test, inbuilt search test, inbuilt modify test, inbuilt delete test. JMeter send request in the order that you add them to the tree. Start by adding the first LDAP requests to the LDAP users element, add then sampler dot then LDAP requests. Select then the LDAP request element in the tree and edit the following properties. One, rename to the add this element. Select add test radio button in test configuration group. This figure shows the LDAP request for inbuilt add test. You do not have to set the server name field, port field, username, password and DN, because you already specified this value in the logging config element and the LDAP request defaults. Next, add the second LDAP request and edit the following properties. One, rename it to search and select this search test radio button in the test configuration group. Next, add the third LDAP request and edit the following properties. First, one, rename to the modify this element and select modify test radio button in the test configuration group. Next, add the fourth LDAP requests and edit the following properties. Rename to here you can see LDAP request for inbuilt for inbuilt delete test, and here the rename to delete element here and select the delete test radio button in the test configuration group. Now we are considering adding LDAP extended request default in building an extended LDAP test plan. Here you can see the LDAP default for our test plan. Begin by selecting LDAP ext users element. Click your right mouse button to get the add menu, then select add, then config element, then LDAP extended request default, then select this new element to view its control panel. Like most JMeter elements, LDAP extended request defaults control panel has a name field that you can modify. In this example, leave this field with the default value. Here you can see LDAP default for our test plan. For each of the element of the different operations, some default values can be filled in. In all cases, when the default is filled in, this is used for the LDAP extended request. For each request, you can override the default by filling the default values in the LDAP extended request sampler. When no value is entered which is necessary for a test, the test will fail in an unpredictable way. We will not enter any default values here as we will build a very small test plan, so we will explain all different fields when we add the LDAP extender samplers. So in this example, we are considering only adding LDAP extended request only. Now we are considering adding a thread bind request in adding LDAP requests. Here you can see a thread bind example. Here first rename element 1 dot thread bind to select the thread bind button here. Enter the hostname value for LDAP server in the server name field. Enter the port number from the LDAP server 636 LDAP over SSL in the port field. Optional, enter the base DN in the DN field. This base DN will be used as the starting point for searches, add, delete, etc. Take care that this must be the uppermost shared level for all your requests. For example, when all information is stored under OU equal users and DC equal test, and DC equal com, you can use this value in the base DN. Step 6 is optional. Enter the distinguished name for the user you want to use for authentication. When this field is kept empty, an anonymous bind will be established. Optional enter the password for the user you want to authenticate with. An empty password will also lead to an anonymous bind. Step 8 optional, enter the value for the connection timeout LADP. Number 9 optional, check the box to use the secure LADP protocol. If you access with LDAP over SSL, LDAPS. Number 10 optional, check the box trust all. If you want the client to trust all certificates. Here you can see a thread bind example here. Now we are considering adding web service adding web service request in building a web service test plan in user manual building WS test. Here the web service request. In our test plan we will use the .NET web service. Since you are using a web service sampler, we won't go into the default wiring web service in this example. If you don't know how to write a web service, Google for web service and familiarize yourself with writing web services for Java and .NET. It should be noted there is a significant difference between how .NET and Java implement web services. .NET web services are document centric, whereas Java web services tend to be RPC centric. Neither approach is perfect and each has limitations. JMeter send requests in the order that they appeared in the tree. Start by adding a sampler web service SOAP request beta go to a Jakarta users element, add, then sampler, then web service SOP request, it's a beta code. Then select web service request element in the tree and edit the following properties. Change the name field to web service SOAP request. Enter the WSDL URL and click load WSDL. Here you can see web service request. If the WSDL file was loaded correctly, the web methods drop down should be populated. If the drop down element remained blank, it means there was a problem getting WSDL. You can test the WSDL using browser that reads XML. For example, if you are testing an IIS web service, the URL would look like this: http:// localhost /mice web service /service.asmx WSDL. Next, select the web method and click configure. The sampler should populate the URL and SOAP action. SOAP action web fields. Assuming the WSDL is valid, the correct SOAP action should be entered. The last step is to paste the SOAP message in the SOAP or XML RPC data text area. You can optionally save the SOAP message to a file and browse to the location. For convenience, there is a third option of using message folder. The sampler will randomly select files from a given folder and use the text for the SOAP message. An important note in the sampler: it will automatically use the proxy host and port pass to the JMeter from the command line. If the fields in the sampler are left blank, if the sampler has values in the proxy host and port text field, it will use the ones provided by the user. If no host or port are provided, JMeter wasn't started with the command line option, the sampler will fail silently. This behavior may not be what users expect. As an exception example, we can consider this one: response code non-HTTP response code org.apache.http.conn.http host connection exception response message non-HTTP response message connect to proxy.usb.com:8080 proxy.usb.com /91.195.240.126 failed connection timeout connect. As an error example, we can consider this one: error requests are not logged in the server for load test in JMeter with 1000 users. Now we are focusing on server, network computer program or device that processes requests from a client server from client. You can refer client server architecture also. In the World Wide Web, for example, a web server is a computer that uses the HTTP protocol to send web pages to a client's computer when the client requests them. On a local area network, a print server manages one or more printers and prints files sent to it by client computers. Network servers, which manage network traffic, and file servers, which store and retrieve files for clients, are two more examples of servers. Here you can see categories of systems. Controller node, the system running JMeter GUI, which controls the test. The worker node, the system running JMeter server, which takes commands from GUI and send requests to the target systems. Target, the web server we plan to stress test. Here you can see the controller node. Controller node is connected to worker nodes, and worker nodes are connected to target. Here you can see a topology in remote test or distributed test. Client or master, the system running JMeter, which controls the slave remote and doesn't send any request. Slave server, slave remote node, the system running JMeter in server mode. JMeter server, which takes the command from the client and send the test plan request to the target system. Target, the server to stress test. Listeners in the test plan send their results back to the client JMeter, which writes the result to the specified files. Samples are not sent back synchronously by default as they are generated. Since JMeter 2.9 default mode is mod strip batch, which returns samples in batch mode every 100 samples, so every minute by default. This is to improve the maximum throughput of the server test, as otherwise sample result has to be sent back before the thread can continue. The mod strip batch strip responds data from sample result, and if you need it changed to another mode. JMeter RMI requires a connection from the client to server. The default port is 1099, and reverse connection in order to return results to the server to the client. This will use high numbered port controlled by the JMeter property client.rmi.local port. Here you can see master node interacts with slave nodes, and slave nodes are connected to target. Here the master node is connected to slave nodes via start test, and slave nodes are connected to master node via test results here, and test plan slave nodes are connected to target via test plan requests. As an example, we can consider here JDBC configuration, and you can see here the database URL JDBC :MySQL / this one. This is the IP address of the server. This is the server name here, and the 3306, and /cloud. This is a CS node here. By selecting JDBC users element, click your right mouse button to get the add menu and then select add, then config element, then JDBC connection configuration, then select this new element to view its the control panel here. Here variable name, here my database bound to pool. This needs to uniquely identify the configuration. It is used by JDBC sampler to identify the configuration to be used. Here you can see a database URL, JDBC :mysql :/ here. This can be IP address, IP of the server, and then here :3306 / cloud, and JDBC driver class com.mysql.jdbc.driver, username and password, the username of the database, and password here, password for the username. JMeter creates a database connection pool with the configuration settings as specified in the control panel. The pool is refers to in the JDBC request in the variable name field. Several different JDBC configuration elements can be used, but they must have unique names. Every JDBC request must refer to a JDBC configuration pool. More than one JDBC request can refer to the same pool. Now we are here. You can see the public static final string server in class FTP sampler in package org.apache.jmeter.protocol.ftp.sampler. In this example, we are considering public static final string server in class SMTP sampler in package org.apache.jmeter.protocol.smtp sampler. Now we are considering public static final string server in class TCP sampler in package org.apache.jmeter.protocol.tcp.sampler. Now we are here. You can see now we are considering server mode in running JMeter in getting started. Here you can see the example. For distributed testing, run JMeter in server mode on the remote nodes, and then control the servers from GUI. You also use the CLI mode to run remote test. To start the server, run JMeter -server .batch on each server host. The script also let you specify the optional firewall or proxy server information, say H proxy server hostname or IP address, -P proxy server port. Here you can see the example, and if you want the server to exit after a single test has been run, then define the JMeter property server.exit after test equal true. To run the test from the client CLI mode, use the following command, where -G is used to define JMeter properties to be set in the servers, dash x means exit the servers at the end of the test. Dash R, capital R, server 1, server 2 can be used instead of R dash R to provide the list of servers to start. Overwrite remote underscore hosts, but does not define the property. If property JMeter engine dot remote dot system dot exit is set to true, default is false, then JMeter will invoke system.exit 0 after stopping RMI at the end of the test. Normally this is not necessary. Now we are considering Tomcat in monitoring server applications in monitoring. So now we are considering monitoring server applications in monitoring servers. This is under Tomcat here. The lambda cron, this is the web address, and JMeter add-on sampler for rstatd. This is the web address, and visualization for the result of rstad sampler. Sorry, SWI rstad sampler. Here the web address. As an exception example, we can consider this exception occurred in the environment J2SDK 1.3.1.03 and Solaris 8. Java.rmi.server exception, remote exception occurred in server thread. Nested exception is java.rmi.unmarshal exception. Error, unmarshalling arguments. Nested exception is java.lang.class.not.found exception. org.apache.jmeter.engine.remote JMeter engine implementation underscore stub. Java.rmi. Unmarshal exception, error unmarshalling argument. Nested exception is java.lang.class. Class not found exception. org.apache.jmeter.engine.remote JMeter engine impl stub, and java.lang.class not found exception. org.apache.jmeter engine.remote JMeter engine impl stub at and etc. As an error example, we can consider this error occurred when JMeter is running with non-GUI mode with JMeter, then -n, then -t, script.jmx -r, slave machine IP -l log.jtl. Error in rconfigure method, java.rmi.server exception. Remote exception occurred in server thread. Nested exception is java.rmi.unmarshal exception. Error unmarshalling argument. Nested exception is java.lang.class.not.found exception. kg.apc.jmeter.threads.ultimate thread group. No security manager. RMI class loader disabled. Now we are focusing on server response. Server response. As an example, we can consider this assertion control panel with a pattern. The response assertion control panel lets you add pattern strings to be compared against various fields of the request or response. Pattern strings are contains and matches. These are Perl style regular expressions. Equals and substring, these are plain text and case sensitive. You can also choose whether the strings will be expected to match the entire string, entire response, or if the response is only expected to contain the pattern. You can attach multiple assertions to any controller for additional flexibility. Note that the pattern string should not include enclosing the delimiters, that is, use price semicolon backward slash d plus, not / price colon backward slash d plus / by default, pattern is in multi-line mode, which means that the dot meta character does not match new line. In multi-line mode, caret and $ match the start and end or any line anywhere within the string, not just start and end of the entire string. Note that backward slash s does not match new line. The case is also significant. Here you can see attribute or parameter name, descriptive name for this element that is shown in the tree. You can see apply to attribute. This is for use with samples or samplers that can generate subsamples. For example, HTTP sampler with embedded resources, mail reader, or samples generated by the transaction controller. Main samples only applies to the main sample. Subsamples only applies to the subsamples. Main and subsamples applies to both. JMeter variable name to use. Assertion is to be applied to the content of the named variable. This attribute is required attribute, and here you can see a field to test. Instruct JMeter which field of the request or response to test. Test response, the response text from the server, that is the body excluding any HTTP headers. Response code, that is for example 200. Response message, for example OK. Response headers, including set cookie headers if any. URL sampled, and document text, the extract from various type of documents via Apache Tika. Ignore status, instruct JMeter to set status to success initially, and here ignore initially. The overall success of the sample is determined by combining the result of the assertion with the existing response status. When ignore status checkbox is selected, the response status is forced to successful before evaluating the assertion. HTTP responses with statuses in the 4xs and 5xs ranges are normally regarded as unsuccessful. The ignore status checkbox can be used to set the status successful before perform further checks. Note that this will have the effect of clearing any previous assertion failures, so that make sure that this is only set on the first assertion. Fail to test attribute is required parameter, and ignore status attributes also a required parameter. Now here you can see pattern matching rules attribute indicates how the text being tested is checked against the pattern. Contains true if the text contains the regular expression pattern. Matches true if the whole text matches the regular expression pattern. Equals true if the whole text equal the pattern string, case sensitive. Substring true if the text contain the pattern string, case sensitive. Equals and substring patterns are plain strings, not regular expressions. Not may also be selected to invert the result of the check or apply each assertion in or combination. If one pattern to test matches, assertion will be okay instead of and all patterns all patterns must match so that assertion is okay. This pattern matching rules attributes is a required parameter. Patterns to test attribute, a list of patterns to be tested. Each pattern is tested separately. If a pattern fails, then further patterns are not checked. There is no difference between setting up one assertion with multiple patterns and setting up multiple assertions with one pattern each, assuming other options are the same. However, when ignore status checkbox is selected, this has the effect of cancelling any previous patterns. Effect of cancelling any previous assertion failures. So make sure that the ignore status checkbox is only used in the first assertion. Pattern to test attribute is a required parameter. Now we are as an example, we can consider class response assertion in package org.apache.jmeter.assertions. Test element to handle response assertions. See assertion GUI for GUI. Now we are considering adding a response assertion in building an LDAP test plan. You can add a response assertion here. The LDAP response assertion. You can add the response assertion element. This element will check the received response data by verifying if the response is successful. Add, then assertion, then response assertion. Note if this position in the tree, this position in the tree, the response assertion will be executed for each LDAP request. First, select text response radio button in the response field test, response field to test group. Select substring radio button in pattern matching pattern to test in pattern matching rules group. 3, click add button and add the string successful in the pattern to test field. Here you can see LDAP response assertion. As an As an example, as an error example, we can consider this result: assertion error false, assertion failure true, assertion failure message, test failed, test expected not to contain / invalid username or password. Here, by looking at the HTTP response, we can see that actually this is a 200 code. This is a response from screen with screen to enter username and password. In the body, you can see here invalid username and password, sign-on failed. So based on the default validation, this will be considered okay, and the script will continue even if you are configured to stop on an error. And this will lead to errors at some point because you are not logged in. So, and they will be more difficult to understand since they occur later on. Well, assertions allow you to fail this step so that you quickly understand where the problem comes from. In this situation, we could check that we do not have an invalid logging message. Now we are focusing on JMeter saves all responses. JMeter saves all responses. As an example, we can consider this. These properties in here in JMeter.properties file. This one indicates how to set properties to get vertical bar delimited format that will output results like this. This is the result, and the corresponding JMeter.properties that need to be set are shown here. The one oddity in this example is that output underscore format is set to CSV, which typically indicates a comma separated values. However, the default delimiter was set to be a vertical bar instead of comma, so the CSV tag is misnomer in this case. Think of CSV as meaning character separated values. Here JMeter.save service.output underscore format. This section helps to determine how result will be saved. The commented out values are the defaults. Legitimate values XML, CSV, dB, the only XML and CSV are currently supported, default to CSV. Here jmeter.save service.assertion underscore result underscore failure underscore message. True when field should be saved, false otherwise. Assertion underscore result underscore failure underscore message only affect CSV output, default to true. Here JMeter JMeter.save service default underscore delimiter for use with comma separated value CSV files or other formats where the fields values are separated by specified delimiters, default to comma. For tab one can use /T. As an example, here you can see a screenshot of control panel of sample result save configuration. Listeners can be configured to save different items to the result log files JTL by using config pop-up as shown here. Items with CSV after the name only apply to the CSV format. Items with XML after only apply to the XML format. CSV format cannot currently be used to save any items that include line breaks. Here you can see the configure button. Here you can see this figure shows an example of result file configuration panel. Here the file name, the name of the file containing sample results, the file name can be specified using either a relative or an absolute path name. Relative paths are solved relative to the current working directory, which defaults to the bin directory. JMeter also supports path relative to the directory containing the current test plan JMX file if the path name begins with title / or whenever or whatever is in the jmeter.save.saveservice.base underscore prefix JMeter property, then the path is assumed to be relative to the JMX file location. Browse, the file browse button. Errors, file browse, select this to write read only result with errors, this attribute, and success attribute, select this to write read only result with errors. If neither errors nor success is selected, then all results are processed. You can see the configure button here. Here you can see the classes in the package org.apache.jmeter.save, and we can consider package org.apache.jmeter.save as an example also. Here the CSV save service. This class provides the means for saving or reading test result as CSV files. Listener result wrapper. listener result wrapper is for calculated results generated by listeners like aggregate listener and monitor listener. Save graphics service, this class responsible for taking the component and saving it as a JPEG, PNG or TIFF. Save service handles settings up extreme serialization. Script wrapper converter handles extreme conversion of text scripts. Test result wrapper. As an example, we can consider this one, save responses to a file for error logging. Here this file is saved as myservices_1832_myprofile26.unknown. Now we are considering JMeter collects data to manipulate statistical information. JMeter collects data to manipulate statistical information. Here you can see a screenshot of control panel of graph results. Graph results must not be used during load test, as it consumes a lot of resources, memory and CPU. Use it only for either functional testing or during test plan, debugging and validation. Here the listener graph results. The graph results listener generates a simple graph that plots all sample times. Along the bottom of the graph, the current sample in black, the current average of all samples, blue, the current standard deviation, red, and the current throughput rate, green, are displayed in milliseconds. The throughput number represents the actual number of requests per minute the server handle. This calculation includes any delays you added to your test and JMeter's own internal processing time. The advantage of doing the calculation like this is that this number represents something real. Your server in fact handle that many requests per minute, and you can increase the number of threads and or decrease the delays to discover your server's maximum throughput. Whereas if you made calculations that factored out delays and JMeter's processing, it would be unclear that you could conclude from that number. Here data plot the actual data values, average plot the average, median plot the median, deviation plot the standard deviation, a measure of variation, throughput plot the number of samples per unit of time. These individual figures at the bottom of this display are current values. The latest sample is the current lapse sample time, shown on the graph as data. The value displayed on the top left of the graph is the max of 90th percentile of response time. As an error example, we can consider this error occurred while simulating 50 concurrent users through JMeter in an environment with graph results in JMeter. JMeter.thread.JMeter thread test failed, java.lang.out of memory error. We are now focusing on end process. As an example, we can consider command stop control dot. Stop command available from the menu. Stop control dot. Stop the threads immediately if possible. Many samplers are interruptible, which means that active samples can be terminated early. The stop command will check that all threads have stopped within the default timeout, which is 5000 millisecond equal 5 seconds. This can be changed during the JMeter property JMeter engine.threadstop.wait. If the threads have not stopped, then a message is displayed. The stop command then can be retried, but if it fails, then it is necessary to exit JMeter to clean up. As an example 2, we can consider shutdown command shutdown control comma stop shutdown command available from the menu. Shutdown control comma request the threads to stop at the end of any current work. Will not interrupt any active samples. The model shutdown dialog box will remain active until all threads have stopped. If shutdown is taking too long, close the shutdown dialog box and select run, stop, or just press Ctrl plus dot. When running the JMeter in CLI mode, there is no menu and JMeter does not react keystrokes such as Ctrl dot. So JMeter CLI mode will listen for commands on the specific port, default 4445. You can also see JMeter engine.none GUI.port. JMeter supports automatic choice of an alternate port if the default port is being used, for example by another JMeter instance. In this case, JMeter will try the next higher port, continuing until it reaches the JMeter property JMeter engine.nonegui.maxport, which default to 4455. If max port is less than or equal to port scanning will not take place. The chosen port is displayed in console window. The commands currently supported shutdown, grateful shutdown, stop test now, immediate shutdown. These commands can be sent by using shutdown.cmd.sh or .sh or stop test in .cmd or .sh script respectively. The scripts are to be found in the JMeter bin directory. The commands will only be accepted if the script is run from the same host. As an example 3, we can consider public static void endTest method in class JMeter context service in package org.apache.jmeter.threads, called by mainframe and then text ended method, clears start time field. An exception example, we can consider JMeter stop test now exception, class JMeter stop test now exception. This exception is for use by functions etc. to signal a stop test now condition where there is no access to the normal stop method. Stop test now means interrupting current running samplers, which will mark them as failed. This class is in the package org.apache.jopen.util. As an error example, we can consider this error: JMeter kills without case occurred. JMeter killed without any error notification within MSM instance. Now we are focusing on get report. Get report. A report is a document that presents information in an organized format for a specific audience and purpose. Although summaries of reports may be delivered orally, complete reports are almost always in the form of written documents. As an example, we can consider this one report providing metrics. This is generated through a dashboard generator. The dashboard generator is a modular extension of JMeter. Its default behavior is to read and process samples from CSV files to generate HTML files containing graph views. It can generate the report at the end of load test or on demand. Here application performance index table that computes for every transaction in the APDX based on configuration values. For tolerated and satisfied thresholds. Here request summary graph showing the success and failed requests. Here transaction control sample results are not taken into account percentage. Here you can see a generation from an existing sample CSV log file dashboard generator. The dashboard generator is a module extension of JMeter. Its default behavior is to read and process samples from CSV files to generate HTML files containing graph views. It can generate the report at the end of load test or on demand. As example 2, we can consider this command. This is generation after load test. Here -n run JMeter in non-GUI mode. Here -t the JMeter test.jmx file to run. -t capital last will load last used file. -l and the argument the file to log samples to. -e generate report dashboard after load test. -O report output folder. Here you can see HTML report dialog menu. With dashboard generator. You can generate HTML report using menu item tools, then generate HTML report. Here the result file CSV or JTL, the CSV output of a test run. This is a required parameter, and the attribute user.properties file. The user.properties file used to run the load test. This is a required parameter. And output directory, the directory where you want the report to be created must be empty. And if no output directory is defined, the controller will use JMeter home /bin /report-output. You then only have to click the generate report button and wait for an information dialog to appear. If the report generation takes more than 2 minutes, adjust the property generate underscore report underscore UI dot generation underscore timeout. As an example we can consider package org.apache.jmeter.report.co. This package contains the components used for passing the load test results and writing the computed results. Here you can see all classes and interfaces. Here the abstract sample writer, the base class for implementing the sample writer, controller sample predicate. This class the class controller sample predicate provides a way to define whether a sample is a controller. Converters, this class converts provides provides converters to of string. Convert exception, this class convert exception provides an exception when convert string method dot execute fails. CSV file represent a CSV file. CSV sample reader class for reading CSV file. CSV sample writer, this class is used to write samples to a CSV destination, output stream writer or a file. Data context, the class data context provide the map to store data for reporting generation. JSON util, this class the class JSON util provides the helper functions to generate JSON. Sample represent a sample read from a CSV source. Sample builder, this class is meant to simplify the building samples. Sample comparator, define the comparator for sample instances. Sample exception, thrown when some sample processing occurred. Sample metadata, describe the sample structure by holding sample column names and their matching indexes. Sample metadata parser, simple parser to get a sample metadata instance. Sample predicate, interface sample predicate represent a predicate to apply to a sample. Sample selector, T selection, type parameter T selection. The interface sample selector represent a type projection from a sample. Sample writer, describe the sample writer basic operations. Basically, a sample writer is able to write samples to an unknown destination and close it. String converter, type parameter dtest. The interface string converter represent a converter from a string to another type. Time helper, this class the class time helper provides a helper function to easy time display. Now we are considering response time distribution includes transaction controller sample results in generating report dashboard. Now we are considering filtering configuration in requirements in configure and dashboard generation. In the example here, you must only modify the search or order, keep the rest. To ensure you set property jmeter.reportGenerator.exporter.html.series_filter to keep only transactions you want in the report. If you don't want everything in here, you must only modify a search or order, keep the rest. Now we are considering generation from an existing CSV log file, existing sample CSV log file in generating reports. Use the following command here. Now we are considering default graphs. Here we are considering active thread graph consumer. This graph represents a number of active threads over time. This is an example default graph, and supports controller discrimination is false. Now we are considering generating custom graphs over time. They must use the ID prefixed custom underscore. You can graph any sample variable in CSV over time. You can customize your graph by setting their properties in the user.properties file. They must use the ID prefix custom underscore. To specify that this graph is a customized one, you can here. Here is an example of custom graph configured that graphs variables ts dash hit. As an exception example, we can consider this one. The class generation exception. The class generation exception provides an exception when report generation fails. This is in package org.apache.jmeter.report.dashboard. Error generating the report org.apache.jmeter.report.dashboard.generation exception cannot assign jmeter.report_generator.apd ex_satisfied_threshold to property set_satisfied_threshold map dash set satisfied threshold. Skip it facing same error after setting the threshold as well. This is end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.